So the first video that I will be posting is on infant brain development and what happens in this little one's head through the first years. I've used a lot of resource from Margot Sunderland, who's a psychotherapist. She's written a wonderful book called What Every Parent Needs to Know, and there's a great chapter on that, on infant brain development, and also the programs by Professor Robert Winston, like The Human Body and Child of Our Time, have excellent information on how the brain develops. So, millennia ago, we were primates still on all fours, and there was a point when we went to standing, and when we stood we began to have the use of our hands, and in doing that we became more creative. We could create weapons, hunt, paint, and in this development of creativity our intelligence grew and our brain size grew. However, we were now standing, which meant that females' pelvis had narrowed. So that meant that we were unable to give birth to babies with large heads, basically. So what that meant was that the human baby began to be birthed incredibly immature cognitively. To use chimpanzees as a comparison, a chimpanzee baby is born with a brain that's already about 45% developed. For an infant baby, they are just over 20% developed, and we'll talk about the parts of the brain that are still developing when they're born. When an infant baby is born, they have their reptilian brain, which is the brainstem, spinal cord, your very, very deep core primitive parts of the brain that have been there for millennia and are similar to, many species. That reptilian brain is responsible for your unconscious automatic reflexes like breathing, temperature regulation, digestion, and your fight or flight instinct as well. They also have elements of their mammalian brain, which is made up of areas such as the pituitary gland, your amygdala, your thalamus and hypothalamus. And that area is generally called your emotional control centre, responsible for distress, rage, joy, lust in adults, care and nurture for others. And that centre tends to regulate your fight or flight instinct, which is your more unconscious reflex. And you'll see with all of these areas, and the more research that comes out of it, every area is interactive and also malleable, particularly when you are very little. It's incredible how malleable and how complex the brain is. And so even though we kind of say the hypothalamus is responsible for this sort of emotion response, amygdala tends to recognise threat signals and cues, actually it's an incredibly malleable system, and if there are issues when they're very little, the brain can adapt and use different parts of the brain for other functions, which is just amazing, really. I remember when I was doing my masters, we learnt about a girl who was born with half a brain, so she only had one of her lobes, the right hemisphere, I think, and yet she was completely able to do everything that we could do, function normally. So that entire right hemisphere was doing everything that for us the entire brain would be doing. The brain had just adapted to connect everything into that side of her brain as opposed to all the other aspects. So it is an amazing organism and the most complex in the whole world. But because of that, oh, very sniffy boy. Because of that, we're born incredibly immature. So a baby is born with about 20% of its brain already intact, and that's generally their primitive responses, their automatic responses, and part of their emotion, such as distress, and that's why they cry as a response to communicate. What is amazing though, and then the final area of the brain that develops predominantly outside of the womb and throughout our whole lives is the rational brain, which covers the frontal lobes and all the way around. It encompasses the whole of the mammalian brain and the reptilian brain, and that makes up the vast majority of our whole brain. It's about 80% of our brain is the rational brain, responsible for creativity, imagination, flexible thought, problem solving, language, compassion for others, socializing. It is your higher order thinking, and babies aren't born with it at all. That is developed in our environments and in our interactions with others, which is quite scary for parents to think about, and but also quite exciting that we as parents hold the key to supporting the next generation in their development of compassion, care for others, and love for others as well. And this is how it happens, really. An infant is born with in the region of 200 billion neurons all around its brain, just waiting to connect with each other. There aren't many connections in an infant brain when they're first born, but immediately from birth, and some research even suggests in the womb it's already starting. For example, they can recognise the mother's voice or familiar adults' voices, and they're following light even within a womb. There are connections happening, but predominantly from birth, straight away connections are forming, millions per second, based on their experiences, such as following a finger, listening to a sound, watching someone's face. All of these things are forming connections between these different neurons and helping that baby form a view of the world, themselves, and how they interact within the world. A simple example, baby cries, mummy feeds it. That's a connection, and if that gets reinforced continually and continually, the baby will learn that when they're in distress, their mummy comforts them, or their parent comforts them. And then what does that help them see about the world? They are loved, they are cared for, they are nurtured, and therefore that helps them develop a self and an identity that has of having more confidence and self-worth within themselves. It's an extrapolation, but you see that these tiny little connections that are repeated day in, day out, consistently, have an impact on how this child develops. So the impact there and the implication is that every tiny little experience that we have with our children, of smiling to them, of playing to them, of feeding them, of giving them cuddles, of playing music to them, every single one of those tiny little experiences that can sometimes seem monotonous, that can sometimes seem very boring, and that can sometimes seem very repetitive, each one of those experiences are critical in reinforcing these connections between the brain that help the infant show that they are loved, that they are safe, that the world is safe, and that they can interact and respond to the world in an exciting way. So you're developing a baby's curiosity, and you're developing the baby's confidence and comfort in themselves, giving them a secure world in which to explore. So that is the power of the repetitive nature of parenting, that the baby is learning all the time through those repetitive connections, because the stronger that repetition is, the stronger and more hardwired that connection between the neurons is. So day in, day out, feeding, clothing, loving, cuddling them, day in, day out, is what will hardwire that brain into knowing that they are loved and that they are safe. So keep going, even when it seems frustrating and tiring at times. It's an amazing job, and every single little experience that you're doing with them is having an impact on their brain and helping them in how they see the world. Thank you. thank you for listening.